He was a monarch of the modern age, his kingdom forged not of land, but of algorithms and fiber-optic cables. Kalen al-Sadiq's net worth was a number so vast it had lost all meaning, a constellation of zeros that could purchase nations. He was a predator in a bespoke Brioni suit, a man whose quietest whisper could trigger seismic shifts on the stock exchange. And at this precise moment, simmering in the hushed opulence of New York's most exclusive restaurant, Ethel, he was a thundercloud about to burst. The deal, a legacy-defining acquisition that was more about history than money, was crumbling. His fury was a physical entity in the room, a low-frequency hum that made the ice in the water glasses tremble. He was ready to scorch the earth, to reduce this temple of gastronomy to ash and ruin. But as he rose to unleash the storm, a quiet waitress, a ghost in a black and white uniform, moved to clear the adjacent table. He was about to dismiss her, to look through her as he looked through everyone, until she spoke. Not to him, but a soft, reflexive whisper to herself as she caught a falling spoon. 4 words in a nearly extinct dialect of courtly Arabic. 4 words that were a key to a lock he thought long buried. 4 words that made the simmering rage of Kalen al-Sadiq turn to ice. Ethel wasn't a place one went to eat. It was a place one went to be seen not eating. It was a cathedral of calculated silence, where the patrons were as curated as the microgreens on their plates. The air was thick with the scent of old money and new ambition. In this gilded sanctuary, Clara Hayes was an acolyte of the invisible order. Her uniform was a study in stark simplicity, her brown hair pulled back in a severe bun that tugged at her temples, a constant, dull ache she had long ago learned to ignore. She moved with a liquid grace born of 1,000 shifts, a choreography of refilling glasses and clearing plates that was its own form of silent art. She could anticipate a need before it was felt, a ghost at the edge of vision, ensuring the seamless flow of the evening. But tonight, the carefully orchestrated tranquility of Ethel was being strangled by the occupant of the corner booth, the one they called the King's Table. The table belonged to Kalen al-Sadiq. Clara had served the ultra-wealthy before. They were a peculiar species, men who complained about the mineral content of the water, while orchestrating corporate takeovers that would leave thousands jobless. But al-Sadiq was different. He hadn't just arrived, he had materialized, flanked by 2 lawyers whose pale, anxious faces looked like they had been sketched by Giacometti. Kalen al-Sadiq radiated a cold, predatory stillness that was far more intimidating than any overt display of power. He was tall, with the lean, powerful build of a desert cat, dressed in a charcoal suit so perfectly tailored it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin. His face was a collection of sharp, aristocratic angles, dominated by eyes the color of dark, bitter coffee, eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. A Patek Philippe gleamed on his wrist, not as a timepiece, but as a quiet declaration of war against the very concept of time. "Mr. al-Sadiq, your table," Mr. Dubois, the manager, had breathed, his deference so profound it was almost a physical bow. Al-Sadiq hadn't acknowledged him. He had simply moved to the table, his presence sucking the warmth from the air around him. "Whiskey, Macallan 25, he'd clipped, the words sharp as broken glass. "And bring the bottle." For 2 hours the table was a vortex of tension. The lawyers, a duo Clara mentally labeled Fear and Panic, picked at their $150 plates of seared scallops with the enthusiasm of men on death row. They murmured phrases like, "The provenance is complicated, Kalen, and Sheikh al-Fahad is a man of particular tastes." Kalen al-Sadiq said nothing. He stared into the amber depths of his whiskey, swirling it slowly, his silence a weapon of mass destruction. Clara served them with her practiced, serene detachment. She refilled his water, her hand a steady rock, even as his dark eyes flickered over her for a nanosecond, dismissing her as part of the decor. She noted the small, intricate silver pendant she wore around her neck, a tiny antique fountain pen nib her grandfather had given her. It was her only ornament, a secret piece of her real life worn in this sterile, borrowed one. "Will you be ordering an entree, sir?" she had asked, her voice a carefully modulated whisper. He had waved a dismissive hand, a gesture that spoke of empires and dynasties. "He'll have the lamb," he said, gesturing to fear. "He'll have the Dover sole," nodding at panic. "And I will have another whiskey. Stop hovering." Clara had simply inclined her head. "Of course, sir." She was used to it, the casual cruelty, the effortless assumption that her uniform rendered her subhuman, a flesh-and-blood automaton with no thoughts, no feelings, no life beyond this room. She was Clara Hayes, curator and sole proprietor of the Scribe's Nook, a dusty, failing antique shop in the East Village, filled with the treasures and ghosts of her late grandfather's life as a historian. She could identify the calligraphic style of a 14th-century Persian manuscript from 10 paces, and was fluent in 3 languages, including the specific, archaic Arabic dialect her grandfather had taught her as a child. And she was serving a $250,000 bottle of whiskey to a man who was behaving like a petulant god. The breaking point arrived with the subtlety of a lightning strike. Caelan's phone, a sleek black slab lying dormant on the white linen, vibrated once. He snatched it up. As he read the message on the screen, a single muscle in his jaw knotted, a visible tremor of fury. He stood, not with a sudden jerk, but with a slow, deliberate violence that was infinitely more terrifying. "Excuse me," he said, the 2 words shearing through the restaurant's hushed reverence. He turned his back on his companions and paced towards the vast, floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city's glittering expanse. And then he began to speak into the phone. The language was Arabic, a torrent of it. Fast, guttural, and laced with a cold, precise rage. Clara was clearing a nearby table, her back to him, but she didn't need to see his face to understand the words. She froze for a heartbeat, her hands full of heavy porcelain. It wasn't the language that surprised her. It was the specific cadence, the choice of words. It was the Arabic of the old courts, formal and poetic, a language of scholars and kings, now being used as a dagger. "You dare to show me a cheap imitation?" Clara's mind translated instinctively, the academic part of her brain that her grandfather had so carefully honed, clicking into place. "You think my eyes are blind to my own family's work? This is an insult to my ancestors' graves." Fear and panic had turned a ghastly shade of white. They were making a show of cutting their food into microscopic pieces, their eyes wide with a terror that was almost comical. Other diners, the titans of finance and industry, were beginning to stare, their forks hovering in mid-air. This was Ethel. Voices were not raised here. Fortunes were lost with a quiet nod, not a furious tirade. Mr. Dubois was already gliding across the room, his face a perfect mask of professional horror. "This game is over. The deal is dead." Caelan's voice rose, no longer a controlled whisper, but a resonant snarl that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. He was eviscerating the person on the other end of the line, his words a flurry of perfectly enunciated, archaic insults. He wasn't just angry, he was wounded. He was a king whose crown had been spat upon. He jabbed a finger at the window, at the city below, as if accusing it of complicity. Tell the sheikh his collection will remain incomplete. The star of Sadiq will never be in his possession." He ended the call by stabbing his thumb at the screen. The silence that descended in its wake was absolute, a vacuum where sound had once been. Kaylan al-Sadiq turned. His face was a mask of glacial rage. He glared at his two cowering lawyers. "We're leaving," he said, switching to English. Fear, or perhaps panic, half rose. "But Kaylan, the final offer. We were supposed to." "The deal is dead," al-Sadiq repeated, his voice dangerously low. He tried to pass off a forgery. A forgery. "For 6 months, we have negotiated for the return of the astrolabe, and he tries to fool me with a cheap replica from a Turkish bazaar. He thinks I am a fool, an ignorant American." He snatched his jacket from the back of his chair. "My jet is at Teterboro. We're flying to Geneva tonight. By sunrise, I'll begin a hostile takeover of his entire European holding company. I will dismantle his empire piece by piece." He balled up his napkin and threw it onto his untouched plate. It was not a gesture of surrender. It was the casting of a gauntlet. He began to stride towards the exit, a human hurricane of wealth and fury. His lawyers scrambled to follow, fumbling with briefcases and wallets. "Sir," Mr. Dubois squeaked, bravely stepping into the storm's path. "The bill, sir." Kaylan didn't break stride. He impaled the manager with a look of such pure venom that Dubois physically flinched. "Bill my office," he growled. "They'll wire the funds. Now get out of my way." He was about to barge past the manager, past the Metrodise station, and out into the night, leaving a crater of chaos and a bill that Clara knew would be deducted from the staff's pay for the next 6 months. She was standing by a dessert cart, arranging delicate spun sugar sculptures. He was heading directly for her, his eyes fixed on the door, seeing nothing but his rage, his jet, his revenge. He didn't see her. He was a force of nature, and she was just a small, insignificant rock in his path. He didn't swerve. His shoulder clipped the edge of the dessert cart. The cart jolted violently. A tall, impossibly delicate sugar sculpture of a swan, the chef's masterpiece, tilted, teetered, and began its slow-motion slide toward the marble floor and certain oblivion. Clara moved without thinking. Her hands, accustomed to the delicate weight of centuries-old artifacts in her grandfather's shop, shot out. One hand steadied the cart, while the other, with a feather-light touch, caught the swan's base just as it slipped over the edge. It was a movement of practiced, instinctive grace, a gesture of preservation that was as much a part of her as breathing. The swan was safe. Her job was safe. But he was still walking away. He hadn't even noticed, and something inside Clara snapped. It wasn't just the shove. It wasn't just the bill. It was the profound, soul-crushing indignity of it all. It was the casual erasure, the fact that he lived in a world so rarefied, so insulated by his own wealth, that he could collide with another human being and not even register the impact. Kaylan was 3 steps from the door. Clara took a breath. She didn't shout. She didn't raise her voice. She simply spoke, her voice clear and resonant, projecting just enough to cut through the suffocating silence. She spoke in the same archaic, courtly Arabic he had just used to declare war. But her words were not of anger. They were a line of poetry, a lament known only to a handful of historians, the personal motto of a long-dead family of artisan scholars. The star falls, but the craft remains. Kaylan al-Sadiq froze. It was not a gradual stop. It was a full, system-wide shutdown. One foot was in mid-stride. His hand was outstretched towards the heavy brass door handle. He became a statue of fury, every line of his body locked and rigid. The entire restaurant held its breath. The hurricane had ceased to spin. He was now the absolute, terrifying stillness at its eye. Clara continued, her voice unwavering, though her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She was still holding the sugar swan, its delicate form cool against her fingertips. A true craftsman knows his own mark. For 5 eternal seconds, he did not move. Clara thought he might turn and destroy her with a single word. She thought of her grandfather's shop, of the overdue bills piled on the small desk, of the life she was trying so desperately to hold together. Maybe she should have just let the swan break. Then, very, very slowly, Kalen al-Sadiq turned. The rage was gone from his face. It had been utterly annihilated, replaced by a profound, seismic shock. His dark eyes, stripped of their anger, were wide with a raw, analytical disbelief. He looked at her, but he was no longer seeing a waitress. He was seeing a ghost, an impossibility, a riddle wrapped in a black and white uniform. He walked back towards her, his steps now measured, silent, predatory. He stopped a foot away, so close she could feel the heat of his body, smell the faint, expensive scent of vetiver and ozone. "What?" he said in English, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Did you just say to me?" Clara met his gaze, refusing to flinch. She was still holding the ridiculous sugar bird. The power dynamic of the room, of her entire life, had just tilted on its axis. I said, "A true craftsman knows his own mark, sir," she replied, her English crisp and neutral. She gently placed the swan back on the cart, her movements precise. "You seem to have forgotten yours." She gave the slightest nod towards the table, towards the chaos he was leaving in his wake. A muscle ticked in his jaw. He was recalibrating everything he thought he knew. He had mistaken a queen for a pawn. He stared at her, his eyes boring into her, as if trying to read the secrets of her soul. Then he spoke again, switching back to the formal Arabic, his words a sharp, pointed test. "That dialect, that proverb, it is not from any book. Where did you learn it?" It was a trap, a question designed to expose her. Clara held his gaze, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. She answered in the same flawless, poetic tongue. "It is not learned from books, but from life, sir. My grandfather believed that history is not ink on a page, but a story whispered from one generation to the next." Kalen al-Sadiq's jaw tightened. He had thrown a dart, and she had caught it and handed it back to him, point first. She hadn't just demonstrated fluency, she had demonstrated understanding. She had spoken his family's private language. The spell was shattered by Mr. Dubois, who scurried forward, his face a mess of confusion and terror. "Sir, is there a problem with this employee? I can assure you." Kalen held up a hand, a gesture that sliced the manager's words from the air. He didn't look away from Clara. His eyes were still locked on hers, a silent, intense negotiation taking place between them. He turned his head slightly, addressing his lawyers without looking at them. "Pay the bill. Add a 50% tip for the entire staff. Go to the car. Tell the pilot to stand down. Do not call me. Wait for my instructions." "But Kalen, the Geneva flight," panic started to say. "Wait," Kalen commanded, the single word in Arabic carrying the weight of an executioner's axe. The 2 men practically vaporized, fumbling with a black credit card before scurrying out of the restaurant. Kalen then turned to Mr. Dubois. "We require the room." Dubois blinked. "Sir?" "The restaurant, it's closed for the night," Kalen stated. He gestured vaguely at the few remaining, gawking patrons. "Send them home. Compensate them for their meals. Bill me for the inconvenience. I am buying the silence." "But sir, it is only 9 o'clock. Our reservations—" Kalen reached into his jacket and produced his own wallet, tossing a featureless black card onto the dessert cart next to the Sugar Swan. "That is a Sinclair Holdings Centurion card. The limit is a theoretical concept. Charge my company for every reservation. Charge them for the lost revenue for the next week. I don't care. Now leave us." Mr. Dubois stared at the card as if it were a holy relic. He looked at Kaelin, at Clara, and recognized a tectonic shift he could not possibly comprehend. He bowed, snatched the card, and fled, hissing frantic orders into his walkie-talkie. Within 5 minutes, Ethel was empty. The diners had been ushered out with hushed apologies. The staff had vanished into the kitchens. The silence that remained was no longer reverent. It was absolute, owned. It was just Clara, standing by her dessert cart, and Kaelin al-Sadiq, standing in the opulent void of a restaurant he had just rented for the evening. "The cart," he said, his voice softer now. "Leave it." Clara pushed the cart to its station, her hands moving on autopilot. She turned to face him, clasping her hands behind her back in the classic, subservient pose of her profession. He gestured to the king's table, to the chair opposite his own. "Sit." "Sir, I'm still on the clock." He switched back to Arabic, his tone laced with an unfamiliar note of respect. "Please sit. This is no longer a restaurant. It is a negotiating table." Clara hesitated, then walked to the table and pulled out the heavy chair, perching on its edge. Her apron felt like a costume, her uniform a lie. He sat opposite her, leaning forward, the interrogator now in place. "Who are you?" he asked in English. "Clara Hayes, sir." "Stop calling me sir, and you are not a waitress. Tonight it's my profession." "You are a historian," he stated, not a question. "Your accent is perfect, the cadence, the proverbs. It's the dialect of the al-Sadiq court before the exile. It hasn't been spoken in 100 years. Who was your teacher?" "My grandfather," she said, the words tasting of dust and grief. "Arthur Hayes. He was a professor of Middle Eastern history at Princeton. He specialized in lost cultures." Kaelin nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "Arthur Hayes. I've read his work, The Artisan Kings of the Nejd. A brilliant monograph." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "Why are you here, Clara Hayes, serving overpriced fish to hedge fund managers?" The truth spilled out, raw and unvarnished. "He passed away last year. He left me his shop, the scribe's nook. It was his life's work, his legacy, and its failing. The rent, the taxes. This job pays the bills, or it tries to." Kaelin listened, his expression unreadable, a mask of pure calculation. "The deal I was just screaming about," he said, changing the subject with jarring abruptness. "It was with Sheikh Hamad al-Fahad. You've heard of him?" Clara nodded. "The vulture of the Gulf. He collects companies and art, mostly from families whose fortunes have faded." "Precisely," Kaelin said, a grim smile touching his lips. "For generations, the al-Fahad and the al-Sadiq were rivals. My family were artisans, scholars. They were raiders and warriors. They won. My family was exiled, our treasures scattered. The greatest of those treasures was the Star of Sadiq, a celestial astrolabe crafted by my great-great-grandfather. It is a masterpiece of science and art, and Sheikh al-Fahad has it." He leaned forward, the scent of whiskey and power washing over her. "This wasn't a business deal. It was a ransom. He offered to return the astrolabe in exchange for a controlling interest in my tech division, a symbolic victory, the final humiliation of the al-Sadiq line." "And the one he showed you? The forgery?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. "A test," Kaelin growled, to see if the westernized boy still had the eyes of his ancestors, to see if I was a fool who could be tricked out of his birthright. When I identified it as a fake, he feigned ignorance and withdrew the offer, claiming I had insulted him. He was trying to provoke me into this exact reaction: anger, irrationality. He wanted me to storm away so he could claim I breached the negotiations. Clara saw it then, the intricate, venomous trap. It wasn't just about a deal. It was about honor, history, and the deep, bitter wounds of the past. "I have one chance to salvage this," Kalen said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial low. "I have arranged a final meeting, a private viewing, at his hotel, in 1 hour. He thinks I am coming to beg. He thinks I am coming alone, a beaten man." He locked his eyes on hers, and the entire world seemed to shrink to the space between them. "But I will not be alone." "What does this have to do with me?" Clara asked, though a terrifying, exhilarating suspicion was already dawning in her mind. "My entire team of experts, my historians, my translators, they all saw the forgery on the video feed and said it was perfect. They advised me to accept. They are fools who read books, but cannot read a man." "You," he said, the word no longer an accusation but a designation, "spoke my family's motto. You caught a sugar swan as if it were a priceless artifact. You are not a waitress who knows a few phrases of Arabic. You are the granddaughter of Arthur Hayes. You are the keeper of his knowledge." Clara's world was spinning. "Mr. Al-Sadiq, I have a shift. I have to inventory the linen napkins." "I will pay this restaurant enough to rebuild their wine cellar," he said flatly, "and I will pay you enough to save your grandfather's shop. 10 years of rent. Paid in full. Tonight." Her breath caught in her throat. 10 years. It was not just money. It was a lifeline. It was the preservation of the only thing she had left of her grandfather. It was everything. "I'm not a negotiator," she whispered. "I'm a historian. That is why I need you," he said. "Al-Fahad expects a businessman. He expects a lawyer. He will not expect a quiet scholar who knows more about my family's art than he does. You will not be my translator. You will be my authenticator. My secret weapon." She looked at this impossible man, this fallen king trying to reclaim his crown. He was arrogant, ruthless, and quite possibly insane. But he was offering her a chance to step out of the shadows and back into the world she belonged in, the world of history, of craft, of stories. "One condition," Clara said, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. She stood up, forcing him to look up at her. Kalen's eyebrow arched. "Name it. If I do this, I am not your employee. We are partners. You will treat me as your equal, and you will never, ever speak to me with that tone of voice again." She expected him to laugh, to dismiss her, to put her back in her place. Instead, Kalen al-Sadiq also stood. For the first time, they were eye to eye, two sovereigns negotiating the terms of an alliance. He studied her for a long, tense moment, his dark eyes searching hers. Then, a slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. He extended his hand. "My name is Kalen." Clara took his hand. His grip was firm and warm, a shock of life against her skin. "Clara, the funds for your shop are being transferred now," he said, tapping his phone. "We're going to my suite at the Mandarin Oriental. You can't face down a sheikh dressed as a waitress." The ride in the silent, armor-plated Maybach was a journey to another planet. Clara stared out at the blurred lights of New York, a city she had only ever known from street level. Kalen was on his phone, his thumbs a blur across the screen. "I've taken the liberty," he said, without looking up, "of having a few options sent to the suite." "Options?" "Attire," he said, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were sharp, appraising. "Sheikh Al-Fahad is a traditionalist. In his world, appearance is not vanity. It's a language. It speaks of respect, status, and seriousness. They will expect to see a disposable woman. I need them to see a scholar of immense authority. The clothes are your armor, Clara. You are not my equal in this fight. You are my superior. You are the historian. You need to look like it. The presidential suite was a palace in the clouds, a symphony of cream leather, dark wood, and breathtaking views. It was also, at that moment, a high-fashion command center. A team of stylists stood silently beside racks of designer clothing, cases of shoes, and velvet trays laden with jewelry. 1 hour, Kaelin said to the room at large. She needs to look formidable. For the next 45 minutes, Clara was a marble block being chiseled into a new form. Her severe bun was undone, her hair cascading down her back before being styled into a low, intricate chignon that was both elegant and severe. Her makeup was subtle but transformative, accentuating the intelligence in her eyes and the strength in her jawline. Then came the clothes. Gowns were presented and dismissed by Kaelin with a sharp shake of his head. Too loud, too soft, too modern. Finally, a stylist held up a dress of deep, midnight blue silk. It was deceptively simple, long sleeves, a high, modest neckline, and a cut that flowed like liquid ink. It was the dress of a woman who had no need for adornment, whose power was internal. "That one," Kaelin said, his voice decisive. When Clara emerged and looked in the mirror, she did not recognize the woman staring back. The tired waitress was gone. In her place stood a figure of quiet authority, a woman who belonged in the courts of kings. The only piece of her old self that remained was the small silver nib nestled at the base of her throat, a secret anchor to who she was. While she was being transformed, Kaelin was at the suite's large mahogany desk, his own research unfolding. A text came through from his head of security, a compressed file on one Clara Hayes. He scrolled through the biographical data, the education, the financials. Then he stopped at the last entry. Noteworthy asset. Proprietor of The Scribe's Nook, 112 St. Mark's Place. Shop contains the private research library and collection of the late Dr. Arthur Hayes. Kaelin's fingers moved, typing a new query into a private academic database. Arthur Hayes, Al-Sadiq Dynasty, primary sources. The results filled the screen, scanned images of handwritten notebooks, detailed analyses of calligraphic styles, and one file labeled The Maker's Mark of Idris al-Sadiq, a study in micro-engraving and forgery detection. Kaelin's blood ran cold. He looked up from his phone just as Clara walked out of the dressing room. The blue silk whispered around her as she moved. She looked regal. She looked powerful. She looked like the granddaughter of the one man on Earth who had written the definitive guide to spotting a fake star of Sadiq. Kaelin was staring at her, his expression a complex tapestry of shock, awe, and something that looked terrifyingly like fate. "Kaelin?" Clara asked, her voice faltering under his intense gaze. "Is this acceptable?" "Acceptable?" he murmured. He held up his phone, showing her the title of her grandfather's paper. "Your grandfather. He didn't just study my family. He was obsessed with the details, the flaws." Clara's eyes widened in recognition. "His life's work. He always said you couldn't truly appreciate a masterpiece until you understood how to fake it. He believed the Star of Sadiq had a hidden maker's mark, a deliberate flaw to prove its authenticity, a final signature. This changed everything. This wasn't just a lucky guess based on a half-remembered proverb. Her knowledge was deep, specific, and lethal. "Al-Fahad doesn't know about this research," Kaelin said, his voice tight with a new, savage hope. "It was never published. It exists only in your grandfather's private notes." "And in his shop," Clara breathed, understanding dawning. "And in my head." "You are not just my secret weapon, Clara Hayes," Kalen said, taking a step closer, his eyes blazing with an intensity that stole the air from her lungs. "You are my justice." A quiet chime from the door announced their arrival. "Mr. Al-Sadiq, the Sheikh's party is ascending in the elevator." Kalen straightened his tie. He looked at Clara. "The 10 years of rent is a down payment. If you do this, if you expose him, name your price. Anything." "I don't want a price," Clara said, standing taller in her silk armor. "I want him to know that you can't buy history. You have to earn it. I want to vindicate my grandfather's work." Kalen Al-Sadiq smiled. It was the first genuine smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his face, erasing the ruthless CEO and revealing the shadow of the artisan king. "Then let us go hold court." The meeting took place in a private library off the main suite. Sheikh Hamad Al-Fahad was a man who looked like he had been carved from ancient desert rock. He wore traditional robes of pristine white, his face a web of fine lines that spoke of cunning, not wisdom. His eyes were small, black, and missed nothing. Beside him stood his son, Rashid, a brutish man in a tight European suit, his face set in a permanent sneer. They saw Kalen and offered thin reptilian smiles. Then they saw Clara standing slightly behind him. Their eyes raked over her, dismissing her instantly. A beautiful woman in a beautiful dress, a decoration, an offering. "Al-Sadiq," the sheikh said, his voice like gravel, speaking in the modern, common Arabic of the boardroom. "You bring your concubine to a matter of family honor," Rashid snickered. "Perhaps he needs her to comfort him after he signs away his company." Kalen's body went rigid, a wave of pure fury coming off him. He was about to retaliate, to let his rage destroy the delicate strategy they had built. But before he could speak, Clara stepped forward. She moved past Kalen, placing herself between him and the sheikh. She inclined her head, a gesture of respect that was not subservient. And then she spoke. Her voice was calm, clear, and pitched to carry in the silent room. She used the same high, courtly Arabic Kalen had used, a language the sheikh and his son understood, but could not speak with any real fluency. "Greetings, great sheikh," she began. "A wise man once wrote that an object only has the value of the story it tells. I am here to help ensure the story we write tonight is a true one." The effect was like a physical blow. Rashid's sneer faltered, the sheikh's eyes narrowed, the casual dismissal replaced by a flicker of sharp, surprised calculation. He had expected a toy. He was facing a scholar. "And who are you to speak of stories?" the sheikh asked, his tone hardening. "I am merely a student of history," Clara replied gently. "But my teacher was Arthur Hayes." The sheikh's back straightened, the name registered. "Hayes, the American historian, the one who wrote about the old families." He looked from Clara to Kalen, and a new, unwelcome understanding began to dawn on his face. This was not the ambush he had planned. "Let us see the artifact," Kalen said, his voice now a cold, calm baritone. With a flourish, Rashid opened a velvet-lined case on the table. There, nestled on a bed of silk, was the Star of Sadiq. It was breathtaking, a complex web of interlocking brass and silver rings covered in delicate engravings. It seemed to hum with a life of its own. "A masterpiece," the sheikh purred. "As agreed, it is yours in exchange for the contracts." He slid a folder across the polished table. Kalen did not look at the folder. He looked at Clara. Slowly, respectfully, Clara walked to the table. She did not touch the astrolabe. She simply looked at it, her head tilted, her eyes scanning its surface. The room was so quiet, they could hear the whisper of the air conditioning. Rashid shifted, impatient. The sheikh watched, a hawk observing its prey. Clara leaned closer. Her eyes, now accustomed to spotting the tiniest imperfections on ancient pottery and manuscripts in her shop, were searching. She was looking for the flaw, the signature her grandfather had theorized about. And then she saw it. It was almost invisible to the naked eye. A tiny star, no bigger than a pinprick, engraved within the larger engraving of the constellation Cygnus. According to her grandfather's notes, the true astrolabe's micro-engraving should have 5 points. This one had 6. Clara straightened up. She looked not at the sheikh, but at Colin. "My grandfather," she said, her voice filled with a soft, academic sadness, her English returning for the final, killing blow, "always taught me that the finest forgeries are undone by the smallest vanities. The forger can't resist adding something of his own. A tiny, insignificant mark that says, 'I was here. I was clever enough to fool you.'" She pointed a single, steady finger at the tiny star on the astrolabe. Idris al-Sadiq was a master of the 5-pointed star. It was his family's sigil. Whoever made this was a brilliant craftsman. But he was not an al-Sadiq. The silence that followed was a living thing, a monstrous, suffocating presence. Sheikh al-Fahad's face, which had been a mask of smug satisfaction, seemed to crumble. The color drained from it, leaving behind a waxy grey pallor. Rashid stared at the astrolabe, then at Clara, his brutish confi. The heavy, soundproofed door of the library clicked shut, a sound as final as a gavel's fall. It did not seal away humiliation. It sealed away a world of brute force and shallow victories, leaving behind a silence of an entirely different quality. This was not the calculated, reverent hush of Ethel, nor the suffocating tension of the negotiation. This was a vacuum, vast and pristine, echoing with the ghost of a truth spoken aloud. In this void, Clara Hayes felt as if she were floating. She remained by the window, her silhouette a slash of midnight blue against the diamond dust sprawl of the city. The dress no longer felt like armor, nor a flag of victory. It felt like a skin she had not yet grown into, a costume for a role she had just been handed, without an audition. The adrenaline, that fierce, brilliant current that had sharpened her mind and steadied her voice, was now receding like a tide, leaving on the shore a profound, trembling exhaustion, and the strange, disorienting landscape of her own life irrevocably altered. She pressed her forehead against the cool, thick glass, the city below a river of anonymous light, a silent, indifferent witness. For a moment, she was just a waitress again, wishing the night was over. Then she was a historian, stunned by the weight of the history she had just made. She was both, and she was neither, and the vertigo of it was terrifying. The soft chime of crystal against crystal broke the stillness. Kalen had moved to a discreet bar carved into a wall of mahogany, his movements economical and quiet. He poured 2 glasses not of whiskey, but of water, the ice cubes cracking softly in the silence. He approached her not with the stride of a conqueror, but with the measured tread of a man entering a sacred space. He stopped a few feet away, a respectful distance, and extended a glass. "For the dust," he said, his voice a low resonance that seemed to fill the room without disturbing the quiet. The throat gets dry when one rewrites history. Clara turned, accepting the glass. Her fingers were unsteady, and for a moment they brushed against his. A spark, not of attraction, but of pure, unadulterated energy, a kinetic acknowledgement of the extraordinary current that had just passed between them. His eyes, stripped of their predatory fury and their cold calculation, held a new light, a deep, analytical curiosity, laced with something that looked unnervingly like reverence. "Your grandfather," he began, his gaze intense. "The paper he wrote. The maker's mark of Idris al-Sadiq." It was more than academic theory, wasn't it? When you looked at that forgery, what did you see? He wasn't congratulating her. He was debriefing her, seeking knowledge, the CEO in him still needing to understand the mechanics of his victory. But the question was also personal, a plea for a story only she could tell. "I saw a lie," Clara said, her voice finding its footing. She took a sip of water, the cold liquid a shock that grounded her. "My grandfather believed that true craftsmanship is a form of confession. An artist, a true artisan, leaves a piece of their soul in their work. My great-great-grandfather, Idris, he was obsessed with the heavens, with perfection. But he was also a humble man. He knew that only God was perfect. So in every piece he created, he would introduce a deliberate, tiny flaw, a signature of his own humanity. On the star of Sadiq, it was a micro-engraving of a star within the constellation of Cygnus. His star always had 5 points. It was his sigil, a prayer to the 5 pillars of his faith. She looked from the glass in her hand to the empty velvet box on the table. The man who made that forgery was brilliant, a master technician. But he lacked the soul of the artist. He copied the form perfectly, but he didn't understand the philosophy. He was arrogant. He thought he could improve upon the original, make it more perfect. So he gave the star 6 points. It was an act of vanity. And as my grandfather always said, vanity is the native tongue of the inauthentic. Kalen listened, his head slightly tilted, absorbing every word not as data, but as doctrine. He walked over to the empty box, running a finger along the velvet indentation where the lie had rested. "Vanity," he repeated softly. "For 6 months, I have fought him with algorithms, with market projections, with leveraged buyouts. I tried to speak to him in the language of numbers, of profit and loss. I forgot that the Al-Fahad family's native tongue is not finance. It is vanity." He turned back to her, and the raw wonder in his eyes was startling. "You didn't just show him a flaw in a piece of metal, Clara. You held up a mirror to a flaw in his character. You defeated him with a poem." A fragile, shaky laugh escaped her. The tension in her shoulders eased by a fraction. He was a historian. He believed the past was always speaking to us, if we only knew the language. The mention of her grandfather brought the cold reality of her life rushing back. The triumph in this gilded cage felt a universe away from the dusty, debt-ridden shop on St. Mark's Place. "I should go," she said, the words tasting like ash. "I have to return. All of this." She gestured vaguely at the dress, the room, the fantasy. "The shop needs to be opened in the morning. The mail needs to be sorted." "Clara." He said her name, and it was a quiet command to halt. He didn't move to block her path, but his presence was an anchor, holding her in place. "The transfer I initiated earlier, for the shop's rent. It was a retainer, a fee for services rendered. It was not your reward for winning this war." "It was more than a reward," she said, her voice small. "It was a miracle. It's enough to keep the lights on, to fix the roof." "Enough is the word one uses for survival," he countered, his intensity returning. But it was a different kind of intensity now. Not of anger, but of creation. A legacy like your grandfather's does not deserve to merely survive. It is not an asset to be kept afloat. It is a treasure that must be shared. He didn't pull out a pre-made plan on a laptop. Instead, He walked back to the bar and leaned against it, studying her. "Tell me about the shop, Clara. Not the bills and the leaking roof. Tell me about the treasures inside." The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her that in years. She thought of the scent of old paper and leather binding, of the slant of morning light through the dusty front window, of the weight of a 16th century Ottoman atlas in her hands. "It's a mess," she began, honestly. "But it's a beautiful mess. There are first editions of travelogues from the 1800s, a collection of pre-Islamic poetry my grandfather translated himself, his notebooks, hundreds of them, filled with his research, his theories. It's a library of one brilliant man's mind. But it's dying. No one comes in. The world outside moves too fast. People want information, not knowledge. They want data, not stories." As she spoke, Kalin listened, his gaze unwavering. He wasn't pitying her. He was analyzing a problem. So the problem is not the value of the asset, he mused, the language of his world meeting hers. The problem is its accessibility, its platform. You are the curator of a priceless collection with no museum. "A museum?" she scoffed gently. "It's a tiny, crumbling shop in the East Village." "Location is irrelevant when the content is unique," he countered. "My company built its empire by taking complex, inaccessible data and creating an elegant, user-friendly interface. We made it beautiful, and we made it essential." He pushed off the bar and began to pace, the energy of a builder radiating from him. "What if we did the same for your grandfather's work? Not just save the shop? What if we transformed it? Restore the building, digitize the archives, create a research grant in his name for young historians, turn it from a dusty relic into a living institution, a place where the past is not just stored, but where it speaks to the future." He had stopped in front of her, his eyes blazing with the vision he was painting. He wasn't offering her a gift. He was proposing a joint venture. The idea unfurled in Clara's mind, vast and terrifying and beautiful. It was the dream she had never dared to have for herself, the one she had assumed died with her grandfather. Tears pricked her eyes, but this time they were not of exhaustion or relief. They were tears of a hope so fierce it hurt. "Why?" she whispered, the single word encompassing a universe of questions. "Why me? Why this? Why are you doing this?" He looked away for a moment, his gaze falling on his own reflection in the dark window, the perfect suit, the severe haircut, the mask of the corporate predator. When he looked back at her, the mask was gone. "Because my father taught me how to build an empire of ones and zeros," he said, his voice raw with a confession she sensed he had never made before. He was a brilliant financier who saw the world as a balance sheet. But my mother was an al-Sadiq. She saw the world as a tapestry of stories. She taught me the names of the stars in the old language before she taught me my multiplication tables. He took a step closer, the space between them becoming charged and intimate. I have spent my entire life trying to reconcile those two worlds. In New York, I am the exotic, ruthless Arab. In Riyadh, I am the soft, westernized American. I am a king of two kingdoms and a citizen of none. I speak the language of hostile takeovers and the language of ancient poetry, and I have never met a single person who understood that they both came from the same heart. His dark eyes held hers, and in their depths she saw a loneliness that mirrored her own. The quiet scholar who served cocktails, the forgotten historian in a city obsessed with the future. "Tonight," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "when you spoke my family's proverb, when you defended the soul of a craftsman against the greed of a barbarian. You didn't just save my business. You didn't just reclaim my family's honor. You took the two halves of my life, the calculus and the poetry, and you made them whole. You are the only person on earth who is fluent in me." The air left her lungs. He had seen her. In the chaos and the fury, he had looked past the uniform, past the historian, and had seen the core of her. And now he was showing her the core of himself. She reached up and her fingers brushed against the small, silver nib of her pendant, her anchor to her own history. "I know what it is to feel like a ghost in your own life," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "To hold a universe of knowledge inside you that no one else can see." His arrogant, world-conquering smile returned, but it was transformed, softened by vulnerability, and it was the most devastatingly beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Then perhaps it is time we stopped being ghosts." He didn't offer her a job. He didn't show her a contract. He extended his hand, palm up, a simple, open gesture. "The Al-Sadiq and Hayes Heritage Initiative. A partnership. Your knowledge. My resources. Together we give the past a voice." She looked at his hand, then into his eyes. This was not a rescue. It was a coronation. She was not being saved. She was being recognized. She placed her hand in his. His skin was warm, his grip firm and sure. It felt like coming home to a country she had never known existed. "I accept," she said, her voice clear and strong. He held her hand for a moment longer than necessary, a silent treaty passing between them. Then he released it, the professional returning, but the warmth in his eyes remained. "Good," he said, a new energy in his tone. "Then our first official act should be an acquisition." He gestured to his phone, which had buzzed silently on the bar. Sheikh Al-Fahad, in his newfound spirit of cooperation, to avoid a rather lengthy conversation with the U.S. Department of Justice, has been remarkably forthcoming. The real star of Sadiq is not in his vault. It never was. He was trying to acquire it himself. It's the centerpiece of a private auction. An auction? Kaelin's smile became sharp, predatory, but this time Clara felt a thrill, not a chill. She was on his side of the hunt now. "In Vienna," he said. "The auction is in 3 days. The world's most ruthless collectors will be there. They will come with money. We will come with the truth." He looked at her, the question clear in his eyes. He was not commanding her. He was inviting her. Clara thought of her small apartment, of the uniform hanging in her closet, of the life she was supposed to return to. It felt like a photograph of someone else. She looked at this impossible man, this king of 2 worlds, who had seen her when she was invisible. "I suppose," she said, a slow smile spreading across her own face, "that the director of the Hayes Initiative will need to authenticate any new acquisitions for the collection." "I would consider her expertise essential," he replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners. She took a deep breath, the last breath of her old life, and let it out. A sigh of release. The future was no longer a series of bills to be paid, but a map waiting to be drawn. They were standing by the window now, side by side, looking down at the glittering, sleeping city. It no longer looked indifferent. It looked like a kingdom of possibilities. "My jet is at Teterboro," Kaelin said softly. "It can be ready at dawn." Clara didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the horizon, where the black of the night was just beginning to soften into the deep, promising blue of a new day. "I'll be ready," she said, and the words were not a promise to him, but a vow to herself.